In the spring of 1943, Adolf Hitler sat in his underground war room and made a decision that would seal the fate of Nazi Germany, and he didn't even realize it. The man who had conquered most of Europe, who had terrified entire nations with nothing but his voice and his vision of racial supremacy, was about to order an offensive that would prove to be the beginning of the end. But before we dive into the moment when the Führer's dreams began to crumble, we need to understand the man behind the madness, the ideology that drove him forward, and the series of pivotal moments that transformed an unstoppable military machine into a desperate, dying regime. Hitler wasn't always losing. In fact, for nearly 3 years, he was winning spectacularly. From 1939 to 1942, the Nazi war machine rolled across Europe like a force of nature, crushing Poland in weeks, humbling France in months, and nearly bringing the Soviet Union to its knees. German soldiers were hailed as the master race, the inevitable victors of history, and Hitler himself was celebrated as the greatest military genius of the age. But history is written by those who endure, not by those who shine brightest in the moment. And beneath the surface of Nazi military triumph, cracks were already forming in the foundation of the Third Reich. The seeds of Hitler's defeat were sown not in 1943, but much earlier, in the decisions he made, the enemies he created, and the fundamental miscalculations that would eventually strangle his empire. To understand when Hitler realized he was losing, we must first go back to the beginning, to a man driven by rage, ambition, and an ideology so poisonous that it would eventually consume everything it touched. Adolf Hitler emerged from the ashes of Germany's defeat in World War I, a failed artist, and a bitter soldier who couldn't accept that his nation had lost. The Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany, imposing crippling reparations and territorial losses that bred resentment in the hearts of millions. Hitler channeled that rage into a political movement, preaching a doctrine of racial superiority and national resurrection that resonated with a people desperate to reclaim their pride. By the early 1930s, he had transformed Germany from a defeated, economically devastated nation into a military powerhouse. And the world watched in a mixture of fascination and horror as he consolidated power, eliminated his enemies, and began implementing his vision of a 1,000-year Reich. But ambition and ideology are poor substitutes for sound military strategy, and Hitler's fundamental mistakes began long before the final reckoning. His first great miscalculation was invading the Soviet Union in June 1941, an operation called Barbarossa that was meant to crush Soviet communism in a matter of months and provide Germany with the living space, or Lebensraum, that Hitler believed the German people deserved. The invasion began with stunning success. German armies advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, surrounding entire armies, and inflicting casualties on a scale that seemed to suggest an inevitable German victory. But the Soviets didn't collapse as Hitler expected, and the further German armies pushed into the vast Soviet landscape, the more apparent it became that they were fighting not just an army, but an entire people, a nation willing to burn its own cities and sacrifice millions to prevent Nazi conquest. The winter of 1941-1942 became Hitler's first wake-up call, as German soldiers, unprepared for the brutal Russian cold and facing increasingly fierce Soviet resistance, found themselves bogged down in a grinding war of attrition that was the exact opposite of the quick, decisive victory Hitler had promised. Yet even as the Soviet campaign stalled, Hitler refused to acknowledge the fundamental problem. He had started a two-front war, the very thing he had always feared. In North Africa, British forces under Montgomery had halted the German advance at El Alamein, and in the Atlantic, German U-boats were losing their battle against American convoys. The United States, which Hitler had grotesquely underestimated, was pouring vast quantities of men, weapons, and supplies into the war effort. and Germany simply didn't have the resources to match American industrial might across multiple theaters. But Hitler's greatest blindness was psychological rather than strategic. He genuinely believed that his will, his genius, and the superiority of the German race would overcome any obstacle. He surrounded himself with yes-men and sycophants, officers who told him what he wanted to hear rather than the harsh truths of the battlefield. As losses mounted and resources dwindled, Hitler retreated further into his own fantasy world, issuing orders that had no basis in military reality and punishing anyone who dared suggest that the situation was anything less than under control. The year 1942 marked the true turning point of the war, though few realized it at the time. In August, German forces attacked the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, and what Hitler intended as a quick capture became the most devastating battle in human history. For months, German and Soviet soldiers fought street by street, building by building, in a nightmare of urban warfare that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. The city became a symbol of Soviet determination and German desperation. And when the Soviets encircled the German Sixth Army in November 1942, it became clear that German invincibility was a myth. When the Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, over 300,000 soldiers had been killed or captured, and the psychological impact on the German people and on Hitler himself was immense. Stalingrad wasn't just a military defeat. It was a moment when German soldiers and citizens began to realize that their Führer might not be leading them to inevitable victory after all. But Hitler, trapped in his bunker and surrounded by propaganda that painted every retreat as a strategic withdrawal and every loss as a temporary setback, didn't fully grasp the implications of Stalingrad until it was far too late. It was in the spring of 1943, in the aftermath of Stalingrad, that Hitler made the decision that would ultimately accelerate his empire's collapse. He decided to launch Operation Citadel, known as the Battle of Kursk, an enormous offensive designed to eliminate a massive Soviet bulge in the front lines and restore German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Hitler believed that a spectacular victory would restore German morale, shock the Soviets back on their heels, and prove that Nazi Germany still possessed the power to dictate the course of the war. But by this point, Soviet intelligence had cracked German military codes, and the Soviets knew exactly where, when, and how the German attack would come. They spent weeks constructing an incredibly sophisticated system of defensive lines, anti-aircraft positions, and reserves, turning the Kursk region into the most heavily fortified battlefield in history. When the German offensive began on July 5, 1943, it was met not with the shock and confusion of previous operations, but with a prepared, well-organized defense that German forces simply couldn't penetrate. For the first time in the war, the German army had committed vast resources to an offensive operation and failed to achieve any significant breakthrough. The battle raged for weeks, consuming enormous quantities of men and materiel, but the result was never in doubt. German forces were bleeding out against a Soviet defense that only grew stronger. And while the Battle of Kursk was still raging, Hitler received news that changed everything. The Allies had invaded Sicily on July 10, 1943. Germany was now being attacked from two sides, with German forces unable to achieve victory on either front, and the dictator who had sworn to crush all of his enemies was beginning to realize that he was caught in a closing vice. It was at this moment that Hitler's psychological state began to deteriorate visibly. He had always been a man prone to rages and paranoia, but now those tendencies intensified as the reality of his situation became undeniable. He moved between moments of wild optimism, in which he spoke of secret weapons that would turn the tide, and moments of crushing despair, in which he acknowledged that Germany couldn't possibly win a prolonged war against the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire. He began keeping irregular hours, sleeping at odd times, and staying awake for days at a stretch, obsessing over military situation maps and issuing orders that became increasingly disconnected from operational reality. His generals, meanwhile, were caught in an impossible position. They could see clearly that Germany was losing, that continuing the war was hopeless, and that every day of fighting meant more death and destruction. But they were terrified of Hitler, who had already executed officers who displeased him and who demanded absolute obedience. Some began to plot his overthrow, but Hitler's hold on power remained firm, maintained through a combination of fear, loyalty from key figures like Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels, and the fact that any attempt to remove him would risk plunging the Nazi state into chaos. So the military machine continued to grind forward, even as it consumed itself. By the end of 1943, the Allies had invaded Italy and were pushing northward, while on the Eastern Front, the Soviets were beginning their relentless advance westward, liberating territory and pushing German forces back. The strategic initiative had completely shifted. It was no longer a question of whether Germany would lose, but how much longer the killing would continue before the end came. In the early months of 1944, Hitler made another fateful decision that would further hasten the Third Reich's demise. He became obsessed with the possibility of an Allied invasion of France, and he ordered massive resources devoted to building coastal defenses and gathering reserves for what he believed would be a decisive battle to repel the invasion. He was convinced that if German forces could destroy the Allied invasion fleet and repel the landings on the beaches of Normandy, it would shatter Allied morale and buy Germany time to develop the secret weapons, jet fighters, rockets, submarines, that he believed would eventually turn the tide. It was a fantasy divorced from any realistic assessment of German capabilities or Allied strength, but it shows how far Hitler had retreated into a world of wishful thinking. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. And despite German resistance, the landings succeeded. German forces failed to push the Allies back into the sea, and within weeks, it became clear that France was being lost. Hitler's response was to order his generals to hold every inch of French territory, to execute anyone who suggested withdrawal, and to fight a war of attrition that Germany simply couldn't win. The Normandy campaign turned into a grinding struggle that lasted months, and by the time Paris fell in late August 1944, it was obvious to everyone except Hitler himself that Germany's military situation was catastrophic. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even worse. The Soviets had launched massive offensives in 1944 that drove German forces back hundreds of miles, liberating Poland, Ukraine, and moving ever closer to Germany itself. Soviet armies, now fully mobilized and equipped with excellent tanks and artillery, were inflicting devastating defeats on German forces. German generals pleaded with Hitler to shorten the front lines, to consolidate reserves, and to prepare defensive positions, but Hitler refused. He couldn't accept the idea of strategic retreat, and he issued order after order demanding that German forces hold their positions or retake lost ground, leading to the destruction of entire armies and the senseless deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. By the summer of 1944, even Hitler's closest associates could see that the situation was hopeless. But instead of accepting reality and seeking a negotiated end to the war, Hitler became more irrationally committed to victory. He spoke of miracle weapons, of a great German counteroffensive that would split the Allied forces and lead to a negotiated peace, of the possibility that the Soviet Union and the Western Allies would turn on each other and allow Germany to emerge from the conflict. He was, in essence, trapped in a fantasy world where his will alone could alter the course of history. In December 1944, Hitler made one final desperate gamble. The Ardennes Offensive, a massive counterattack through the forests of Belgium, designed to split the American and British armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. Hitler believed that a spectacular victory in the West would restore German prestige and might even force the Allies to negotiate a peace settlement. It was a plan based entirely on hope and delusion, and when it failed within days, it effectively ended German military resistance on the Western Front. German forces had exhausted their last reserves, and there was nothing left to stop the Allies' advance into Germany itself. In January 1945, the Soviets launched their final massive offensive from the east, and German armies, depleted and exhausted, crumbled before them. German cities fell in rapid succession: Warsaw, Budapest, and by late January, Soviet forces were less than 100 miles from Berlin itself. Hitler, now recognizing that the end was near, retreated to his bunker in Berlin, the Wolf's Lair, where he would spend his final days. By now, Hitler was a changed man physically and psychologically. His hands trembled with what was likely Parkinson's disease. His vision was failing, and he had become even more detached from reality. He spent hours in his bunker studying military maps that bore no relationship to the actual positions of German forces, issuing orders to defend cities with units that no longer existed, and ranting about the betrayal of his generals and the inferiority of anyone who didn't possess his iron will. His marriage to Eva Braun was hastily arranged in the bunker, and he dictated his political testament, which showed no remorse for the horrors he had unleashed on the world, and instead blamed Jews for causing the war, and called for the continued persecution of the Jewish people even after his death. The German people, meanwhile, were experiencing the full consequences of Hitler's disastrous leadership. German cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing campaigns that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Millions of Germans were refugees, fleeing the Soviet advance and facing an uncertain future. German soldiers were dying by the thousands in pointless last-ditch defenses of territory that would be lost within hours. The economy was in total collapse. Food was scarce, and there was a sense of apocalyptic finality hanging over the nation. Yet even in this desperate moment, Hitler refused to surrender. He continued to fantasize about last-minute victories, about wonder weapons that would destroy the Soviet army, about dividing his enemies through negotiations. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, still spoke of German victory, even as the Soviets were literally pounding on the gates of Berlin. It was a form of mass delusion, a refusal to acknowledge reality so complete that it crossed the line from strategy into pathology. As April 1945 began, Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from all sides. Hitler's bunker was becoming a tomb, a place where the Nazi leadership were increasingly isolated from the reality of their collapsing empire. Officers reported back to Hitler about the military situation, and he would respond with fury at their inability to hold positions that no longer existed or their failure to carry out impossible orders. There were moments when Hitler seemed almost to achieve clarity, when he admitted that the war was lost and that nothing could save Germany. But these moments of honesty were brief, and he would soon return to fantasizing about German counteroffensives and Allied peace negotiations. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler made his final decision. Recognizing that Soviet forces would soon break through to his bunker, and that he would face capture, torture, and execution, he dictated one final testament, married Eva Braun, and then shot himself in the head while she took cyanide. His body and that of his wife were carried outside by loyal officers, doused with gasoline, and set on fire, the flames consuming the physical remains of the man who had brought untold suffering to the world. By May 7, 1945, Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and the war in Europe was over. The question that historians have debated for decades is, when exactly did Hitler realize he was losing? Some argue it was Stalingrad, the moment when German invincibility was shattered for all to see. Others point to the summer of 1943, after the failure of the Kursk offensive and the invasion of Sicily. Still others suggest that it wasn't until 1944, with the success of the Normandy invasion, that it became impossible to deny German defeat. But perhaps the most honest answer is that Hitler never truly accepted that he was losing, not until the very end, when he had no choice but to face the reality that his empire was finished. What Hitler did experience was a gradual erosion of the certainties that had sustained him, a slow dawning awareness that the military situation was deteriorating beyond his ability to control it, and an increasingly desperate psychological state that manifested in rage, paranoia, and delusion. The tragedy of Hitler's realization, if we can call it that, is that it came too late to prevent the catastrophe that his leadership had unleashed. Millions of people had already died in the war he started. Entire nations had been destroyed, and the Holocaust had murdered 6 million Jews, and millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. When Hitler finally began to grasp the reality of German defeat, there was nothing to do but kill himself and leave behind a world marked by the scars of his ambition. The beginning of the end for Hitler wasn't a single moment, but a process of gradual disillusionment, beginning with the failures on the Russian front and culminating in the final collapse of German military power in 1945. It was a process that taught a crucial lesson: that power, no matter how absolute, cannot overcome the consequences of catastrophic miscalculation and moral bankruptcy. Hitler's empire rose because of his will and his ability to channel the fears and resentments of a defeated people. It fell because that will was not enough to overcome the forces arrayed against him, because military machines cannot run on ideology alone, and because history ultimately judges empires not by their brief moments of glory, but by the devastation they leave in their wake. The man who believed himself to be leading a master race to eternal glory instead led his nation to total annihilation. And in the ashes of Germany's defeat, the world learned once again that evil, no matter how confident or how well armed, carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction.